My name is Pyotr Volkov. I am 87 years old now, and I live in a small apartment that is probably too warm, in a city far from the sea and the mountains. My hands shake when I hold a teacup, and my daughter tells me I live too much in the past. She is probably right, but some parts of the past do not stay where you leave them. They follow you. They sit with you in the quiet hours before dawn and demand to be remembered. I was a soldier once. Not a hero, not a decorated officer from the great patriotic war that you see in parades. I was just a conscript, a corporal in the ground forces of the Northern Fleet, stationed on the Kola Peninsula in the autumn of 1951. I was 19 years old, and my world was made of worn leather, cold steel, and the endless gray sky. I am telling you this because I am old, and the weight of this memory has become heavier than the years themselves. What I am about to describe to you is not something you will find in any official military record. It is not a story of battle against a human enemy. It is something else. And I know how it will sound. It will sound like a peasant's ghost story, the kind of thing an old woman whispers to frighten children. I would not have believed it myself. I was a good Komsomol member, raised on dialectical materialism. I believed in engines, in electricity, in the power of the collective will. I did not believe in monsters. But the world, I have found, does not always ask for your belief. Before I get into what happened, if you're new here, consider subscribing. I don't know why you would. I am just an old man with one story to tell, but the young people tell me this is what one says. And drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. It is a strange comfort to know who is listening to an old man's confession. All right, let me tell you what happened on the mountain. Let me tell you about Sergeant Ivanov and Private Misha, and why their names are not on any war memorial. Our posting was near Kirovsk, in the shadow of the Khibiny Mountains. If you have never seen them, they are not like other mountains. They are old, worn-down giants, more like massive, rounded hills. In the summer, they are covered in a carpet of green and gray tundra. But we were there in late October, when the world was turning. The polar night was already beginning to swallow the days, and the sun was a pale, watery disk that barely cleared the horizon before sinking again. The cold was a physical presence. It was a dry, biting cold that found its way through the thick wool of our greatcoats and settled deep in your bones. The wind was relentless. It came down from the plateaus, carrying the taste of ice and empty space. We were a small patrol, just 4 of us. There was me, Corporal Volkov. I was the scout, trained to read the land, to move quietly, to see things before they saw me. There was Sergeant Ivanov, our commander. He was a man carved from the northern rock itself, short and broad, with a face that looked like it had been in a long argument with the frost. He had fought from Stalingrad to Berlin, and carried the quiet, unshakable authority of a man who had seen the worst of what men can do to each other. Then there was Private Misha, a boy of 18 from some farming village south of Moscow. He was soft, still had his farm boy roundness, and was perpetually terrified of the cold, the dark, and Sergeant Ivanov's temper. Finally, we had an attachment, a Zampolit, a political officer named Lieutenant Orlov. He was young, fresh from an academy in Leningrad, with a sharp uniform and a face that hadn't yet learned how to hold back a sneer. His job was to ensure our ideological fitness, to remind us that we were the vanguard of socialist progress, even while we were freezing in a godforsaken Arctic wilderness. Our mission was officially a search and reconnaissance patrol. A few weeks prior, a team of 3 civilian geologists had gone missing from a survey camp deep in the western part of the Massif. The official story was that they had been caught in an early, unseasonable blizzard and were presumed lost. But there were whispers. The blizzard hadn't been that severe, and these were experienced men. Our task was to patrol the area of their last known position, to look for any sign of them or their equipment, and, unofficially, to ensure no foreign agents were using the deep wilderness as a back door into the strategic mining areas around Kirovsk. We set out from our barracks on a morning that was more like twilight. The snow was thin on the ground, just a dusting that highlighted the strange, alien colors of the rock, dull greens and rusty reds from the mineral deposits. We walked in single file, the crunch of our boots the only sound in a vast, oppressive silence. Sergeant Ivanov was in the lead, his PPSH-41 submachine gun held at a low ready. I was behind him, my eyes scanning the terrain, my Mosin Nagant rifle slung on my back. Misha followed me, and Lieutenant Orlov, predictably, brought up the rear, already looking uncomfortable in his stiff new gear. The air was so cold, it felt sharp in your lungs, like breathing in powdered glass. We walked for hours, climbing out of the wooded valleys and into the exposed, wind-scoured tundra of the higher elevations. The world shrank to the man in front of you, the frozen ground under your feet, and the rhythmic burn of your muscles. This was the reality of soldiering. It wasn't glorious charges or heroic speeches. It was boredom, discomfort, and the constant, gnawing cold. We were just doing a job, a routine task in a place that felt like the edge of the world. We had no idea we were walking toward a place that was not on any of our maps. The first thing that felt wrong was the silence. I don't mean the quiet of an empty landscape. I was used to that. This was a different kind of silence. It was a dead silence. We had been walking for most of the day, and I had not seen a single living thing. No ptarmigan bursting from the heather, no scurrying lemming, not even the track of an Arctic fox in the snow. The birds were gone. I mentioned it to Sergeant Ivanov during a brief halt. We crouched behind a rock outcropping, the wind tearing at our collars. I just said, "Quiet today, Sergeant." He grunted, his eyes scanning the gray horizon. He had noticed it too. He didn't need me to point it out. He took a drag from his hand-rolled cigarette, the paper sticking to his chapped lip. "Too quiet," he corrected me, and the way he said it made the hairs on my neck stand up. Misha was getting visibly nervous, his head on a swivel, his rifle clutched in his mittens like a holy relic. Lieutenant Orlov chose that moment to deliver a short, impromptu lecture on bourgeois superstition. He said the silence was a product of the season, a simple meteorological and biological fact. He told Misha that a good Soviet soldier places his faith in material reality, not in peasant fears. Ivanov just stared at him until he trailed off. Then he crushed his cigarette in the snow and said, "Move out." We found the geologist's camp in the late afternoon, tucked into a shallow bowl between two spurs of a mountain. The sun was already gone, leaving a bruised purple stain in the southwestern sky. The camp was a ruin. Two canvas tents, the heavy-duty kind meant for Arctic conditions, were shredded. Not torn by wind, but ripped open, the fabric hanging in long, ragged strips. A small stove had been knocked over, and scientific equipment, Geiger counters, rock hammers, transits, was smashed. A wooden crate of canned food had been splintered, the cans themselves punctured and bent, their contents frozen solid on the ground. My first thought, the one my brain immediately supplied, was a bear, a big, hungry polar bear that had wandered inland, or a brown bear crazed by hunger before hibernation. It made sense. It was the only thing that did. Orlov immediately declared it was the work of saboteurs. Western agents, he said, his eyes alight with a kind of grin excitement. They must have interrogated the geologists and destroyed the camp to cover their tracks. But Sergeant Ivanov wasn't looking at the tents. He was circling the camp slowly, his gaze fixed on the ground. I followed his line of sight. There were tracks. They were everywhere in the thin layer of snow, churned and overlapping. Some were clearly the boot prints of the geologists, but there were others. They were huge. At first glance, you'd think bear, but they were wrong. A bear track is round, flat-footed. These were longer, more ovoid, like a massive dog's, but with a distinct heel print like a man's. And the claws. The impressions in the snow showed claws that were not the thick, curved claws of a bear. They were sharper, more slender, almost like talons. Ivanov crouched down, scraping a bit of snow away from one of the prints with a gloved finger. He said nothing. He didn't have to. We all saw it. The stride was enormous. The distance between the prints was longer than any man could make, even running. There was something else, too. A smell. It was faint, masked by the cold, but it was there. A thick, musky odor like a wet dog that has rolled in something dead. It was a rank, animal smell, coppery and unsettling. Misha whispered, "What is that? What kind of animal does that?" "Shut up, Misha," Ivanov ordered, but his voice lacked its usual snap. He was looking at the tracks leading away from the camp, up a narrow, scree-filled ravine. They went up, not down. Orlov was still talking about his saboteurs, trying to make the evidence fit his theory. Perhaps they used special snowshoes to disguise their prints, he suggested. Sergeant Ivanov finally looked at him. He said, "Lieutenant, with all due respect, shut your mouth." Orlov's face went white, then red. He was about to pull rank, but the look in Ivanov's eyes stopped him. It was a look that said he had seen enough death to know its various signatures, and this was one he didn't recognize. And that scared him more than any political officer. The light was failing fast. The temperature was dropping. We had a choice: make our own camp here, in this ruined place, or follow the tracks. Ivanov made the decision. "We follow," he said. "We need to know what we're dealing with." It was the correct military decision, but it felt like the worst possible choice we could make. We entered the ravine as the last of the light bled from the sky. The moon was rising, nearly full, and it cast a cold, sterile light on the snow and rock, painting the world in shades of silver and black. The walls of the ravine were steep, funneling the wind so that it moaned and whispered around us. Every loose rock Misha dislodged with his boot sounded like a gunshot in the oppressive quiet. The tracks were easy to follow in the moonlight. They went straight up the center of the ravine, a single set of prints. Whatever this thing was, it moved with an unnerving economy of motion. There was no sign of struggle, no slipping on the loose scree. It just went up. I had my rifle off my shoulder now. The cold metal of the receiver was a comfort under my glove. My training as a scout had taught me to use all my senses, to be an extension of the landscape. And the landscape was screaming a warning. My skin prickled. The feeling was primal, the ancient terror of a prey animal that knows a predator is near. It's a feeling that bypasses your brain and sinks straight into your spine. I kept scanning the tops of the ravine walls, dark shapes against the slightly less dark sky. Lieutenant Orlov was grumbling behind me, complaining about Ivanov's recklessness, but his words were thin, robbed of their authority by the sheer menacing emptiness of the place. Then we heard it. It wasn't loud. It was a sound that seemed to be absorbed by the snow. A series of low, guttural clicks. A chuffing, almost like a steam engine building pressure. It came from somewhere above us, ahead. We all froze. Ivanov held up a hand, his head cocked. The sound came again, closer this time. It was a wet, throaty sound, full of menace. And then I saw it. On the ridge to our left, silhouetted against the moonlit clouds, was a figure. My first thought was that it was a man. A very large man, wearing a massive fur coat and a fur hat, hunched over. Maybe one of Orloff's saboteurs, but it was too big. The proportions were wrong. The shoulders were impossibly broad, the head set low upon them. It was perfectly still, watching us. For how long? Had it been watching us since we left the camp? Orloff saw it too. He raised his Tokarev pistol. "Identify yourself," he shouted, his voice cracking. The figure did not respond. It just watched. Then it moved. It didn't climb down the steep, treacherous scree slope. It flowed down it. It moved with a liquid grace that was terrifying to watch, its long limbs absorbing the uneven terrain without a single misstep. It was fast, impossibly fast, and silent. The small avalanche of pebbles and snow it dislodged was the only sound it made. My brain was scrambling, trying to fit what I was seeing into a category I understood. Bear? No bear moved like that. Man in a suit? The thought was absurd, insane, but my mind clung to it for a precious second. It was a desperate attempt to keep the world rational. But as it reached the floor of the ravine, about 100 meters from us, the rational world shattered. It straightened up, and it was not a man. It stood on 2 legs, but they were not human legs. The joints were bent backward, like a dog's or a goat's, giving it a hunched, perpetually tensed posture. It was immense, easily 2.5 meters tall, maybe more. The moonlight silvered the fur that covered its body, a thick, matted coat of black and gray, streaked with something dark that I knew was not mud. Its arms were long, too long for its body, and they ended in hands that were a horrific blend of human fingers and wolf-like paws, tipped with thick, yellow-black claws. Its chest was a massive barrel of muscle, heaving with each breath, which came out as plumes of steam in the frigid air. But the head is what I see when I cannot sleep. It was not the simple head of a wolf. It was a nightmare fusion. The snout was long and filled with teeth, lips pulled back in a silent snarl, revealing gums that were black in the moonlight. The teeth were not the clean fangs of a wild animal. They were yellowed, some broken, like an old dog's, but they were the size of railway spikes. And the eyes. They were not animal eyes. They glowed with a faint reflected light, a sickly yellow-green, but behind that glow was a terrifying, hateful intelligence. They were looking at us, sizing us up. The smell hit us then, a wave of it, the same musky, rotten stench from the camp, but 100 times stronger. It was the smell of a predator, of filth and old blood and damp earth. It was the smell of death. For a long moment, nobody moved. We were 4 soldiers with rifles and a submachine gun, and we were frozen like rabbits in a snare. My body was screaming at me to run, to scream, to do anything, but I was locked in place. My training, my discipline, all of it evaporated in the face of this impossibility. It was Lieutenant Orlov who broke the spell. He was a man of ideology, a man who believed the world was a machine that could be understood and controlled. This thing broke his world. He screamed, a high, thin sound of pure terror and outrage. He yelled, "Enemy combatant, surrender or be shot!" It was the most absurd, pathetic thing I have ever heard. The creature responded to his voice. It lowered its head, and a growl rumbled from its chest, a sound so deep it vibrated in my bones. And then it moved. It wasn't a run or a charge. It was an explosion. 1 second it was 100 meters away. The next it had covered half that distance in 2 impossible bounds. It was a blur of dark fur and murderous intent. Misha, poor Misha, finally broke. He let out a choked sob and tried to bring his rifle up. He was fumbling with the bolt, his hands clumsy with cold and terror. He never had a chance. The creature was on him in the next bound. I saw one of its long arms lash out. The claws, which I'd seen only as impressions in the snow, were real, and they were razors. They caught Misha across the chest, and his thick greatcoat might as well have been paper. The sound was a hideous, wet tearing. Misha was thrown backward, a strangled cry cut short. He was dead before he hit the ground. That's when Sergeant Ivanov opened up. The stuttering roar of his PPSH-41 was deafening in the narrow ravine. The stream of orange tracers slammed into the creature's chest and shoulder. I saw the fur fly, saw dark divots appear where the 7.62 millimeter rounds hit home. It staggered, a guttural roar of pain and fury ripping from its throat, a sound that cracked the frozen air. But it didn't go down. It barely seemed to slow. It turned its terrible head, the intelligent, hateful eyes fixing on Ivanov. It ignored the bullet still hammering into it and lunged for him. My own paralysis broke. My training, drilled into me by months of repetition, took over. I dropped to one knee to steady my aim, brought the stock of my Mosin Nagant to my shoulder, and found the creature's head in my sights. Aim for the center mass, the instructors had always yelled. But this thing's center mass was absorbing a full magazine from a submachine gun. I put the iron sight right between its glowing eyes and squeezed the trigger. The kick of the rifle against my shoulder was familiar and solid. In the flash, on my bullet strike high on its skull, gouging a furrow of fur and flesh. It screamed, a sound that was half wolf howl and half human shriek of agony, and it threw its head back, but it was still standing. It swatted at Ivanov with a casual, brutal force, a backhanded blow that sent the sergeant flying through the air. He hit the ravine wall with a sickening crunch of bone and cloth, and slid down into the snow, motionless. The world devolved into chaos. Sergeant Ivanov's submachine gun lay silent in the snow. Misha was a dark shape, unmoving. Lieutenant Orlov was screaming, a continuous, high-pitched wail of a man whose mind has been completely unhinged. He was firing his pistol, the small-caliber rounds popping uselessly in the vast, cold emptiness. The creature barely noticed him. It shook its massive head, blood, black in the moonlight, welling from the wound I had given it. And then it turned its attention to me. It looked right at me. And in that moment, I understood that this was not a dumb animal. The look in its eyes was not simple hunger or territorial rage. It was personal. It was a cold, calculating hatred. It knew I was the one who had hurt it. It knew I was the most dangerous one left. Time seemed to stretch and slow down. I could hear my own heart hammering against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat. I could feel the cold of the snow seeping through the knee of my trousers. I could smell the gunpowder and the creature's foul stench mingling in the air. I worked the bolt of my rifle, the smooth, oiled sound of steel on steel, a tiny anchor to reality. Ejecting the spent casing, chambering a new round. My hands were shaking, but they performed the task. I brought the rifle back up. The creature took a step toward me, then another. It was limping slightly, favoring the leg where Ivanov's bullets had hit. It was hurt, but it was far from beaten. I knew, with a certainty that was as cold and hard as the rock around me, that I was going to die. I could maybe get one more shot off, but it wouldn't be enough. It would be on me before I could work the bolt again. I thought of my mother, a fleeting image of her face in the kitchen of our small apartment in Murmansk. It was a strange, calm moment of absolute despair. I braced myself, but then it stopped. It was only about 20 meters from me. It lifted its head, its nostrils flaring, sniffing the air. Its glowing eyes darted from me to Orlov, who had finally stopped screaming and was just standing there, shaking and weeping. Then it looked back toward the two bodies lying in the snow. It seemed to be thinking, making a decision. The intelligence in its gaze was the most terrifying thing I have ever witnessed. It was weighing its options, finishing us off or securing its kill. For a reason I will never understand, it chose the latter. Perhaps it judged that we were no longer a threat. Perhaps its hunger was stronger than its rage. Or perhaps it was something else entirely, some motive I could never comprehend. It turned away from me, moving with that same unnatural, fluid lope, despite its injuries. It went to Sergeant Ivanov's body. With a horrifying ease, it bent down, grabbed the front of his greatcoat in its teeth, and slung his body over its shoulder, as if he weighed nothing. It did not even glance back at us. It turned and began to ascend the opposite wall of the ravine, using its free hand and its powerful legs to climb the sheer rock face with the agility of a mountain goat. In seconds, it was over the top and gone. We were left alone. Orlov and I, two survivors in a frozen, silent ravine, with the body of our comrade staining the snow a few meters away. The only sound was the wind, which had returned to its mournful, whispering song, as if nothing had happened at all. Getting back was a blur. I don't remember much of the walk, only fragments. I remember trying to get Lieutenant Orlov to move. He was catatonic, just staring at the spot where the creature had disappeared. I had to shake him, slap him, yell his name until his eyes focused on me. I remember him starting to babble, not about monsters, but about highly trained commandos, Western agents in experimental camouflage suits, using hallucinogenic gas. His mind was desperately trying to build a framework, any framework, to contain the horror. I left Misha's body. I couldn't carry him. I took his rifle and his ammunition, and I covered him with his greatcoat. It felt like a profound failure, leaving him there for whatever might come back. But survival is a brutal, selfish instinct. All I could think about was putting distance between us and that ravine. We stumbled through the rest of the night, guided by a compass and pure fear. Orlov kept falling, and I kept hauling him back to his feet. I was on autopilot, my body moving while my mind was stuck replaying the events in a silent, screaming loop. The flash of claws, the roar of Ivanov's gun, the impossible weightlessness of his body as it was carried away. When the gray dawn finally broke, we saw the lights of the base. We were met by a sentry who looked at us as if we were ghosts. We were covered in frost, our faces gaunt, and Orlov was incoherent. The debriefing was held in the base commander's office. It was a small, warm room that smelled of wood smoke and stale paper. There was the commander, a hard-faced major, and a man from the NKVD, and of course, Lieutenant Orlov, who had regained some of his composure. He told the story. He told them we were ambushed, a surprise attack from the ridges by a team of highly skilled operatives. He described them as large men, dressed in animal furs for camouflage, moving with incredible speed. He said they used psychological warfare, strange noises to disorient us. He said Ivanov and Misha fought bravely, but were overwhelmed. He said I provided covering fire which allowed him, a valuable political officer, to escape. He made it sound like a military action, a brutal but comprehensible military action. They all looked at me. The major asked, "Corporal Volkov, is this an accurate account of what transpired?" I looked at Orlov, at his clean uniform and his desperate, pleading eyes. I looked at the NKVD man, whose face was a blank mask of professional suspicion. What could I say? Could I tell them the truth? That we were attacked by a creature from a dark fairy tale, a 7-foot-tall wolf that walked like a man. I knew what would happen. At best, they would think I had gone mad from combat stress, and I would spend the rest of my life in a psychiatric hospital. At worst, they would think I was lying to cover up my own cowardice, or that I was part of the conspiracy myself. They would shoot me. So I looked the Major in the eye and I said, "Yes, Comrade Major, that is what happened." The relief that washed over Orlov's face was disgusting. The official report was written. Sergeant Alexei Ivanov and Private Mikhail Morozov were listed as killed in action, victims of an enemy raid. A whole battalion was sent into the mountains the next day to sweep the area. They found nothing. They found the ruined camp. They found Misha's body. Of Sergeant Ivanov, there was no trace. The official explanation was that the saboteurs had taken him for interrogation. The geologists were officially declared to have been buried in an avalanche that had conveniently occurred in the same ravine. The case was closed. The entire sector of the Khibiny was declared a restricted military zone for the next 2 years. No one was allowed in or out without special permission. I was transferred to a coastal battery a week later. No one ever spoke of it to me again. It was buried, like so many other uncomfortable truths are, under layers of official paper. The experience changed me. It scraped something out of my soul and left a hollow space that the cold has never quite left. For years, I had nightmares, not of the fight, but of the quiet moment before it. The silence, the feeling of being watched. I would wake up in my bunk, slick with sweat, the rank, musky smell of the creature thick in my nostrils. I finished my service, went home, got a job at the shipyard, got married, had children. I lived a normal life. But underneath, the memory was always there. It became a part of my own internal landscape. I could never again look at a forest or a mountain range without a knot of fear tightening in my stomach. I would scan the ridgelines, a habit I could never break. The sight of a large dog would sometimes make my heart seize for a second. My wife used to ask me what was wrong, why I would sometimes stare into space with such a haunted look. I never told her. How could I? How do you tell the person you love that you once saw a monster kill your friends, and that the world is not the safe, rational place we pretend it is? Over the years, I've tried to make sense of it. I've read books on folklore, on zoology, on psychology. I've entertained every possible explanation. Was it a mass hallucination, brought on by stress and cold? 4 men don't have the exact same hallucination, one that leaves 2 of them dead and 1 missing. Was it Orlov's saboteurs in some kind of advanced suit? The technology for that did not exist in 1951, and no suit can explain the speed, the strength, the raw biological reality of that thing. I am left with only one conclusion, one that my rational, Soviet-educated mind still rebels against. It was exactly what it looked like. A lycanthrope, a werewolf, a name from a children's story. But the names we give things do not change what they are. What haunts me most is not the violence. I saw violence in my dreams for years. It is the small details, the way it flowed down the scree slope, a movement of impossible grace, the sound of its claws on the rock, the intelligence in its eyes. That is the part that defies all explanation. It wasn't just a beast driven by instinct. It made choices. It assessed us. It chose to attack Misha first, the weakest one. It prioritized Ivanov when he became the biggest threat. And it looked at me, and made a conscious decision to leave me alive. Why? Was it wounded and knew it couldn't take both Orlov and me? Was it a display of power? Or something worse? Was it leaving a witness? I will never know. And that uncertainty is its own kind of prison. The system I had served, the Red Army, the Soviet state, was built on the idea of control. Control of nature, control of society, control of history. But on that mountain, we came up against something that could not be controlled, could not be explained, and could not be admitted. And so the system did the only thing it could. It lied. It erased the event. It sacrificed the truth to maintain the illusion of order. In a way, that was more terrifying than the creature itself. The monster killed my comrades, but the lie dishonored their memory. I am telling this story now for them, for Sergeant Ivanov, a good NCO, who deserved better than to be remembered as a victim of some phantom spies. For Private Misha, a farm boy who never even got to see his 19th birthday. Their real stories were buried in a file cabinet somewhere, stamped top secret, and forgotten. I want someone to know the truth of how they died, even if it is a truth that sounds like madness. I am not asking you to believe me. In your warm, well-lit homes, with the world explained and categorized on your computer screens, my story must seem like a fantasy. I understand that. For most of my life, I have tried to convince myself of the same thing. But I was there. I felt the ground shake when it ran. I smelled its breath. I saw the light of the moon in its eyes. That is my reality, and it is the reality that has walked with me every day for nearly 70 years. So what is the lesson in all this? I do not have one. There is no neat moral to my story. There is only a warning. The world is older and stranger than we think. We draw maps and build cities and pretend we have tamed it, but there are still blank spaces, dark corners where ancient things survive. Be careful in those places. Be humble, because you may find that you are not at the top of the food chain, and that the comforting laws of science and reason do not apply. Sometimes, when the night is very quiet, and the wind blows a certain way, I can still hear the echo of that scream howl in the ravine, and I can still see its eyes. The final haunting image that has never left me is of the creature turning away. It spared me. It made a choice, and in that choice was a message more terrifying than any act of violence. It was a message of contempt. It was telling me that I was insignificant, that I was not worth the effort. I was left alive not out of mercy, but out of arrogance. And that is a heavy thing for a man to carry to his grave.